While North Korea has long been accused of grave human rights abuses, the regime has become even more secluded from the outside world during the COVID-19 pandemic. James Heenan was appointed in 2022 as the new head of the UN OHCHR Seoul Office, filling a post that has been vacant for over 2 years. Under his leadership, the Seoul Office published a report called "These Wounds Do Not Heal," highlighting the enforced disappearance and abductions by North Korea. To discuss the current human rights situation in North Korea and what should be done, Representative James Heenan joins us here at KBS World Radio. Welcome to KBS World Radio, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
It's been almost 6 months since you were appointed to the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner Seoul. Can you tell us what those 6 months were like for you?
Well, they've been very busy, very rewarding, a little tiring. I've met dozens, maybe hundreds of people working on the area of human rights, relevant to the area of human rights in the DPRK, building alliances for government, civil society, the diplomatic corps, victims of violations. I haven't worked on Northeast Asia before. I've worked in other contexts around the world, so it's also been a steep learning curve to understand not just the situation of human rights in DPRK, but the regional context, the security context, the cultural context. I've also had the time to explore Seoul and Korea a bit, which I'm enjoying very much.
I see. So as I understand, the Seoul office was actually established in 2015 to focus on the North Korean human rights issue. But your current post as the representative had been vacant for over 2 years now, or 2 years. What was the reason behind that? And also, what were the most urgent tasks that were in front of you when you started?
Well, the office has been here for 8 years. It's a relatively new office for us. My predecessor did a great job setting up the office. The gap in leadership was purely bureaucratic. It had to do with her moving on and her visas and other bureaucratic issues of her new post, which she's moved to another place in Asia. And in the meantime, my deputy and the 13 staff we have done a great job. When I turned up here, as I said, one of the key things for me was to establish the alliances with government and with others to try to move forward on this issue, which appears to be a little stuck. People appear to be unsure about how to move forward on this chronic human rights issue, which has been there for a very long time. I've come from another situation, Israel-Palestine, which people also think is chronic and stuck. So I have a little bit of experience in dealing with this. But one of the things is to make sure you have your alliances together, and that's what I've spent quite a lot of my time coming here. We had also I had a to-do list as soon as I arrived. We've had to put out 2 major reports, which I'm happy to talk about. We have to work out how to capitalize on the 10th anniversary of the UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korea, to try to work out how we can use that event to move the conversation forward. Part of all of that is also to raise the profile of our office, which was high on my to-do list, and part of that is me being here today as well.
I see. So moving on to North Korea now, tell us a little bit more about what the current human rights situation in North Korea is like.
Well, I mean, where to start? It is a chronic situation. It's not new, it's not temporary, it's been there for a long time, and the violations that we see are deep. The Commission of Inquiry from 10 years ago enumerated in exhaustive detail the sorts of human rights issues we have in DPRK. I don't think any of those have disappeared. Some of them we know improved slightly after the Commission of Inquiry, things like ill treatment and torture and detention. But others have got worse. And we're talking there about summary executions, we're talking about the right to health, the right to food, the right to movement, freedom of movement, the right to information, the right to freedom of belief, including religious belief and political belief. Our work is based on information coming from what we call escapees from DPRK. Not only on that information, but that's a major part of our source of our information. Now, for the last 2 years, the closure of DPRK has meant there's very few of those escapees coming. We obviously have escapees coming. They will have left the country, DPRK, before COVID. They will have been foreign workers in other countries. Or else we have the testimony of those who arrived here after many years. Many stay in China, as we know for many years. So my point is that we don't know exactly what's happening there at the moment. We have a good idea, but not exactly. But what we do know is there's serious issues around the right to food. There's serious issues around freedom of access to information, because the government has promulgated a law about accessing information, particularly cultural information from the Republic of Korea. And we know that the border with the People's Republic of China has been fortified, so right to movement issues have got much worse. But I mean, I could speak for hours about it.
I see. So lots of problems still very much prevalent in North Korea. But speaking of which, North Korean human rights resolutions have actually been adopted at the UN for nearly 20 years now. And critics would also say that there has not been much groundbreaking improvements in the North Korean human rights situation. Do you agree with this statement? What do you think should be done to bring about effective change for people in North Korea?
Well, it is quite depressing. I mean, to have a chronic situation such as this, and action and attention from the international community for years, and it feels like things, if not staying the same, are actually getting worse. I guess a little bit of context. DPRK is not the only situation with that vision. Yeah, there are many human rights situations around the world which have been chronic. We also have a number of situations where, concerted action by the international community appears to have brought almost no results. So, and I can mention some specific examples. I think what we need to understand is a few things. First of all, human rights is always a long-term project in any country. Even here in the Republic of Korea, you have a very strong human rights, how shall I call it, sort of context or community here. You have a strong human rights base to this country, but that came after a long time, like in many countries. So we have to have a mid and long-term view. The second thing is that we know that change in terms of human rights requires that we know what's going on, and that's the role of our office, is to get the facts, to document them, to legally analyse them, and to make them publicly available, transparency. So it's that recording of what's going on, together with support for human rights defenders and victims, which we know will lead to change. Why do I focus so much on facts and documenting facts? We're in the world where now there's so much media, there's so many facts. We're in the world of so-called fake news. Solid, verifiable facts are more important than ever at the moment. And I think that this is the basis for change in the future. But I have to admit with you, at the moment, it is quite depressing.
Right, so you think that documentation is very much important?
Absolutely, absolutely. Documentation is key. It's key, yeah.
So as we've discussed so far, North Korea is consistently identified as one of the world's worst human rights abusers. However, the issue of human rights in North Korea is, in a way, a very complex one, because it is intertwined with not only human rights, but also denuclearization and the issue of inter-Korean relations as well. How do you, as the head of the Seoul office, balance these two issues of human rights and the issue of nuclear security?
Well, I think my role and our role is not so much to balance them, but to bring them together, because that, in my view, has been one of the problems with dealing with DPRK. It's been siloed in the sense of it's been human rights here, and it's been peace and security and non-proliferation here. And a lot of talk about the human rights situation in DPRK, but as soon as there's some crisis, some missiles launched, that talk disappears and we go into a peace and security context. Member states of the United Nations and the United Nations itself are built on a number of pillars. Peace and security is one, human rights is another, development is another. We can't just focus on one. So part of our role is to bring those two together. Now people say to me, how can you say that? How can you say that human rights and peace and security are two sides of the same coin? In many countries, we know now that human rights violations lead to a situation that endangers either peace and security in the country, regionally, or international peace and security. Look at the situation in Syria, yeah? So it actually provokes peace conflict issues, or it makes them worse, as we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine. The situation in DPRK, in my view, is one of the clearest examples where violations of human rights within the country actually directly impact the possibility of conflict, because many of the violations in DPRK are linked to strengthening the military side of the state. So issues like forced labour, issues like and forced disappearance relating to, experts' issues, the issue of resources available for health and education compared to the resources available for armaments. So in my view, we can draw a direct line between human rights violations and the security situation. And you can't deal with the security situation without dealing with the human rights situation.
I see. Now, moving on to South Korea. South Korea's unification ministry announced that it would release on March 31st, it's just 2 days from now, its annual report on North Korean human rights to the public. Although these reports have been published every year since 2017, they remain secret due to security issues. What are your thoughts on the annual reports being released to the general public?
Well, indeed, they weren't published. That was the issue.
Right.
Listen, as I said before, human rights is all about information and transparency, and I can only applaud the government for releasing this report now. It's important for many reasons. It's important for transparency, but it's also important because the Republic of Korea probably has more information than anyone else about what's going on in North Korea and DPRK, and I hope that this is shared in the report. The reports are also sharing reports. Some people say, well, there are security concerns about sharing reports. We publish a number of reports every year. Other member states publish human rights reports. Civil society publish hundreds of reports on DPRK every year. There may be some national security interests, and that's in every country has to deal with that, but I think there's certainly a margin of information that can be made public, and I look forward to reading it on Friday.
I see, so something positive.
Absolutely.
I see. The ministry also said in March that it would launch a committee of experts to advise the government on the establishment of the North Korean Human Rights Foundation. The foundation was also stipulated by the North Korean Human Rights Act that was passed in 2016, but that was 7 years ago actually, but has not been established yet. What do you make of this move by the Unification Ministry?
Well, I mean, this is a matter for the Republic of Korea. You have law, you have legislation that mandates a number of things. As a matter of rule of law, they should be done because National Assembly, your parliament, has decreed that they be done. Some of them have been. We've had the appointment of Ambassador Lee Shin-hwa as the envoy, and we work very well with Ambassador Lee. And this move consolidates that. Clearly, any political issues about the establishment of the foundation need to be sorted out by the political parties in the government. It's not for me to say.
I see. So all in all, what would you say South Korea's role is in resolving North Korea's human rights issues?
Well, first of all, South Korea is key in this story. I mean, obviously, it's the most involved state. One thing I would say is that South Korea does and should continue to join the international consensus on human rights in the DPRK. And in some ways it should lead on that. It should certainly, I've spoken about information, it should be providing any information it can to the international community, including our office, on the human rights situation in North Korea. I realise there may be national security implications for some of that, but whatever they can provide would be useful. One of the things that our office does is to look for pathways for accountability, for holding individuals to account for human rights violations or even international crimes. And the Republic of Korea has a role in that because you have an extremely well-functioning legal system and judiciary. And you have the presence in this country of a number of victims. I think I can say pretty well all of the escapees who come from North Korea are victims of some form of human rights violation. So I think that accountability needs to be looked at closely here to see whether there's a possibility to hold people to account here for violations in the North. We're not saying that South Korea has violated, we're saying it's North Korean violations. And you have experts in this country. South Korea, the Republic of Korea has always provided fantastic judges to the International Criminal Court. So the capacity, the knowledge and the presence of victims on the territory suggests that accountability should be moved forward here. And I think South Korea has a key role to play in that regard. Yeah.
I see, especially in legal accountability, you're saying.
That's one of them, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Information, legal accountability and international leadership. Right. Obviously, if there's issues of human rights with respect to defectors in South Korea, they should also be addressed as a sort of a, how shall I say, a leading by example.
I
Yeah?
see.
Yeah.
I see. So last but not least, what do you hope changes for North Korean human rights by the end of your term, and what kind of future do you envision for North Korea by then?
Changes by the end of my term. Well, I mean, many things are out of our hands. We're a small human rights office, relatively. But first of all, I would hope that, and being reasonable, I would hope that the most egregious forms of violation are lowered in DPRK. One of them is enforced disappearances that we put a report out on yesterday. We would hope that enforced disappearances are not only stopped, but there is some form of acknowledgement and reparation for victims. The thing with enforced disappearance is that those who have disappeared are a victim, but also their families. And we have well over 200,000 people disappeared by North Korea. If you multiply that by the number of family members, and they're all victims of the crime, we're into millions of people who are victims. There are small steps that can be made, which we will be encouraging. Just information about what happened to loved ones. A bit more ambitious would be the return of remains. I realise that might be a bit more ambitious, but why not try for that? I hope that this story of peace and security that we talked about earlier comes together so that human rights issues about DPRK regularly appear in, for example, the United Nations Security Council, that the Council talks about DPRK not just in terms of proliferation and security, which is very important, but also in terms of human rights. I would hope that my UN colleagues get back into North Korea. They're currently outside the UN country team. It's important for the UN to be in there. And I would hope that North Korea engages more with the United Nations, particularly our expert bodies. They do to an extent, and I think that will continue, but I would really hope that that expands because we take a two-track approach. There's an accountability, a harder approach, but also an engagement approach. And we know from experience that you have to engage in order to bring change as well. The door to that has been shut for a long time, but let's see, once the closure of the country ends, there may be opportunities to engage more on human rights.
I see. That is the end of our interview for today. Thank you so much for joining us here at KBS World Radio.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.